Hello, this is Mr. Stansbury. I'm going to take you through the notes on midpoints. At the end of this, you should be able to say I can find the coordinates of the midpoint of a line, and I can find an endpoint of a line given the midpoint and the other endpoint. Okay, so first thing we need to do is take a look at the midpoint formula. So here's our midpoint formula, and basically what it is you're taking the average of the x coordinates, that's adding them together, dividing by 2, and taking the average of the y coordinates, adding them together, divided by 2, and that gives you your midpoint. Okay, let's take an example that will help us figure out how to use this midpoint formula. All right, so given A and B, find the coordinates of the midpoint, which is referred to as M of AB. Okay, so midpoint, we're going to just add the two. Midpoint is, we're going to add the two x's together, divide by 2, and then add the two y's together, divide by 2. So x is 4 and negative 2. 4 plus negative 2, and then the y is negative 7 plus 1. So midpoint is going to be negative 4 plus negative 2, sorry, positive 4 plus negative 2 is 2 over 2. And let's get rid of that. That's a little big. Negative 7 plus 1 is negative 6 over 2. So when we simplify that, we get 2 over 2 is 1, and negative 6 over 2 is negative 3. So the midpoint of these 2 points here is 1 and negative 3. Okay, let's take a look at another example. All right, example 4. M is the midpoint of AB, where A is this and M, the midpoint. They give us the coordinate of the endpoint and the midpoint. Find the coordinates of B using the midpoint formula, and then another thing called equal steps. So let's use the midpoint formula. So we know that the midpoint, we actually have the midpoint, which is 0, 2. So in this midpoint formula, we're going to put 0, 2 in for the midpoint, and then we're going to simply do the rest of this here. So we're looking for point B. So we're going to take the x's and add those together. So we got 3 plus for the coordinates of B, we don't know what the x is, so let's just put x in there, over 2. And then we have that the y coordinate is negative 2, so we go negative 2 plus, we don't know what the y is, so we just call it y, over 2. Okay, now this here is going to be the x coordinate, so that's going to equal this number, and then the negative 2 plus y divided by 2, that's going to equal the y coordinate there, right? So really we can write this as 3 plus x over 2, and we know that when we figure out what x is, that's going to have to end up equaling 0. And then we take negative 2 plus y over 2, the y coordinate, that has to end up equaling this 2, because that's the y coordinate of the midpoint. Okay, so now once we have this here, now we just solve. I'm going to put both of these over 1, so then I can just do cross products, make my life easy. 2 times 0 is 0, and then 3 plus x all times 1, so let's do this. 1 times 3 plus x, which we of course know is just 3 plus x, so we subtract 3 from both sides, and we get that x is, the x coordinate of B is negative 3, so we got negative 3, and then now we got to find the y coordinate. So again, we do cross products, so we got 2 times 2 is going to equal 1 times negative 2 plus y. All right, so we get 4 equals, distribute that 1 through, and that's just negative 2 plus y. Add 2 to both sides, and we get y equals 6. So the other endpoint is going to be negative 3 and 6. Okay, now we're going to actually do the same problem here with a different idea of this thing called equal steps. So here's my take on this. So if we start with 3, negative 2, that's the a coordinate, that's this right here. So we start with 3, negative 2. We have to add something to that or subtract something from each of those to get to the midpoint, which is at 0, 2. So I'm going to say 3 plus what gives me 0, and 3 plus negative 3, 3 and negative 3 gives me 0, and then negative 2 and what gives me 2. So I'm at negative 2. I got to add 2 just to get to 0, and I got to add 2 more to get up to 2, so that's going to be plus 4. Right? So 3 minus 3 is 0. Negative 2 plus 4 is 2. So this information here, that gets us, we know that if we take 3 away from the x and add 4 to the y, that gets us halfway there. So we know to get to the other half of the way that we are going to take that negative 3 and 4, and we're going to add that to the midpoint, because that gets us halfway there. That's the midpoint, right? And so we go 0 plus negative 3 is going to give us negative 3, and 2 plus 4 gives us 6. And that is a different way to find the same midpoint. It's really whatever makes more sense to you. So that's called equal steps. Because again, we took the endpoint and said, what do we have to do to that endpoint to get to the midpoint? And we had to subtract 3 and add 4. Subtract 3 from the x, add 4 to the y, and that got us to the midpoint. And so we know if we start with the midpoint, we're going to also have to subtract 3 and add 4 to get the other half of the way. So just as a visual representation, let's say this is A, let's say this is B, and there's the midpoint, right? To get from here to here, we had to take our A coordinate, subtract 3, and add 4. So that's subtract 3 and then add 4 to the x and the y. So to get the other half, it's the exact same thing. You're going to also have to subtract 3 and add 4. That's why we subtracted 3 and added 4 to the midpoint. Okay? I know that can be a little confusing, so if that's difficult, make sure you ask in class, and we'll be sure to go over some more of those. Okay? There is one last example to take a look at, and that is example 5. Use midpoints to find the missing vertex of the parallelogram. Okay, so here's 4 coordinates of the missing vertex. So we can use the midpoints to find that missing vertex of the parallelogram, which would mean we would find, let's say so we've got this here and this here. Since it's a parallelogram, this is going to be the same as that, and this, length there, I should just put 1, is going to be the same as that there. Okay, so basically this point right here is the midpoint between these two, and then this point is the midpoint between those two. So we could find the midpoint and then use that midpoint and the endpoint to find the other endpoint. Okay, now the whole equal steps that we did from the previous problem is probably going to make this problem a lot easier. Here's the way I would look at this here. So I'm going to say to get from B to A, and I'm going to go from B to A because if I can figure out how to get from B to A, I can use that exact same thing to go from C to D. Okay, because this length here is the same as this length here. You can ignore this other stuff. In fact, let me get rid of that. There, that looks a little better. So this length is the exact same as that length. So if I can figure out how to get from here to there, I can do the same thing from here to there. So if I'm starting at 3, 8, what do I have to do to that to get to negative 2, 6? Okay, so 3, I'd have to subtract 3 to get to 0 and subtract 2 more to get to negative 2, so that's negative 5. And then 8 minus 2 gives me 6. So to get from here to here, I have to subtract 5 from the x and subtract 2 from the y. So I'm going to do the same thing with this here. So I've got my 5, 1, and I'm going to subtract 5, and I'm going to subtract 2 to get to this point here. 5 minus 5 is 0. 1 minus 2 is negative 1. So that means that this D right here is at 0, negative 1. Okay. I'd be more than happy to show you how to do the midpoint and then use the midpoint and the endpoint to find the other endpoint as it says up here, but I find that this way is much simpler. For the most part, once it makes sense, it becomes a lot easier. Okay, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask in class. Thanks.